Robert Jones was born and raised in New York City and received both his BFA and MFA from Brooklyn College. He's written for so many publications, the New York Times, Paris Review, Essence, The Griot, and he is the creator of the social media social justice community, Son of Baldwin. You can find that on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. His new book, The Prophets, was published in January and is a well-deserved bestseller. Welcome, Robert Jones.
Thank you so much for having me, Susan.
Oh, now one of the things that's really important to the Saints and Sinners LGBTQ Literary Festival is our sense of community. And I'm so sorry we're not all together in a big room, and because you would feel it just as I've felt it for years. So talk about finding your community online in Son of Baldwin and what a difference that made in your writing life.
One of the things that was so much of a blessing in starting Son of Baldwin was at the outset informing all visitors that it was a primarily Black LGBTQIA plus space, that people who lived at those intersections would take precedence, and that we would be talking about issues that affected those communities in particular. Not that other people weren't welcome, but that they should understand that it's from this perspective, and that people who inhabit these identities should be treated with the utmost respect. What that did was it opened up opportunities for me to engage with LGBTQ people all across the globe. So could you imagine me in conversation with a Black transgender woman from Zimbabwe, someone that I would have never been able to talk to in person because of geography. Now I can talk to her, and not only can I talk to her, I could learn from her about what it's like to be transgender in Tanzania, and what Tanzanian ideas of gender and sexuality look like, and how they differ from Western ideas about these things. And so that just, by virtue of that conversation, just broadens your perspective on a lot of things. And that in turn helps me to understand, when I'm going to my fiction writing, how to think about these characters, these situations, in ways that are much broader than would have been if I was just relying on my Western American education and not my witnessing and testimony from other people from around the world. So that I couldn't help but be inspired.
And you said at the very outset that in starting Son of Baldwin, part of your purpose was to celebrate and discuss the queer Black aesthetic. So I want you to talk a little bit about how you went about developing that aesthetic. What does that look like in a professional life and a personal life?
That's a great question. At the intersection of Black and queerness, when it comes to art, what I generally notice about Black queer artists or queer artists who are writing or painting or singing is that the binaries sort of start to disappear. So it's not that you're trying to be masculine or that you're trying to be feminine, is that you're allowing those things to converge in a way that is wholly original and gives you such a fuller picture of the art. So when I think about singers like, for example, Luther Vandross, who I think was one of the greatest singers to have ever lived, never came out as a queer person, but was subsequently, well, those of us who were in the know were in the know. When he sings, clearly he sings with such a masculine tone, and yet there's something so feminine and light and delicate and beautiful that melds his voice, such that he's not constrained by the boxes that society wishes to put men in, women in, whomever else in. Being Black and queer allows a certain type of liberation when it comes to the artistic expression. And I see that also in LGBTQIA plus people who are intersecting with whiteness or intersecting with brownness or some other form. There is a sort of liberatory approach to the way we do art that I don't see in people who are not part of that community. And that's why I can always point out, even if the person hasn't publicly made a statement about their sexuality or their gender identity, I can usually tell by the way in which a sentence is constructed, a brush stroke is rendered, the way a note is bent in the singing, that person is being informed by some sort of queer aesthetic.
Fascinating. And what writers have you found this in?
I have found it in Zora Neale Hurston, and I don't know if Zora Neale Hurston was queer. I think that idea is starting to emerge that she might have been bisexual, but I see it in the way she took Black language and put it in her art, when other Black writers of her time were scolding her for doing that.
Right.
She was brave and courageous enough to say, this is how it should be. And that is a form of liberation, to place that Black language as central in art. No one else was doing that. I see it in James Baldwin, in the way he sort of intellectualizes shade, shade as in reading. Mm-hmm. He will say a thing, say its reverse, and then put it back at you. Like one thing he says, when an interviewer asks him a question, he says, "I am not the nigger baby, you are." And only a Black queer man could have said it in that way and held up that mirror in that way. So I see it in that. And I love when I encounter it, because it gives me hope that our people are no longer afraid, that they are finding themselves, and that they are letting the queer people who are coming up after them know that they can also follow down this path. So I love to encounter it when I do.
The Prophets is such an important book, because I can't imagine anybody who would read it and not be changed in some way. Mm-hmm. And one of its many achievements is that it puts queer love at the very center. And it also goes all the way back and gives it a history. So talk about that, dual purpose you had in writing this book.
Certainly. When I was in undergrad, I was an Africana Studies minor and got to read so many great works by so many Black brilliant authors and artists and scholars and such. But something struck me as odd. Prior to the Harlem Renaissance, there is no mention of any Black queer figures or characters or anything. And they sort of just appear during the Harlem Renaissance. We find it in the work of someone like Wallace Thurman, who was writing in 1929 about Blackness and queerness. But before that, there's nothing, except in the context of rape culture and sexual assault, which is the way cisgender heterosexuals saw queerness, only as an aberration, as something depraved, as something non-consensual. And so I found it, for example, in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. She writes about a white plantation owner sexually assaulting a male slave. I see it in Toni Morrison's Beloved, where her character, Paul D, is sexually assaulted by a male overseer. And I thought, yes, there are truths here, but what about love? And that question is essentially what prompted The Prophets, because I went searching everywhere for examples of Black queer love, could not find it. Went to earlier times. I went to pre-colonial African history, and there is where I found it, where Esther Arma, who is a Ghanaian artist, activist, and brilliant scholar and artist. She said, if you asked her great-grandparents, what is a homosexual? They would have said, I have no idea. We don't have that in our society. And people would have taken away from that there are no homosexuals in Ghana. But she said, if you had explained to them what you meant by homosexual, they would have said, oh, you mean love.
Of course.
Because for her people, her society, her tribe, there was no need to give homosexuality or transgenderness separate categories. It was all considered part of the landscape, all of it, human love and sex, all of it. And that freed me because it made me say, of course there were Black people who existed prior to the Harlem Renaissance, particularly in the antebellum slavery period. There was no word for their identities, but the identity isn't non-existent simply because there's not a word for it. It's intrinsic to who we are. So these people were in love even before it had a name.
And language just hadn't caught up with them yet.
And language just had not caught up with them.
That pre-colonial African research was very important and gives us a large section that is kind of at the heart of the prophets as well. And it's a wonderful section because you sort of play a trick on the reader linguistically, and it's and describe that wonderful king.
Yes. One of the things I discovered in my research of pre-colonial African societies was how differently these peoples thought about gender identity, sexuality, spirituality. And one of the great things that I discovered was that for many of these societies, king was simply a title, and whomever held that title was king, irrespective of their genitals. So there were many women kings. And that was such a mind-blowing idea that I said, I have to incorporate this because it provides a wonderful contrast when juxtaposed against how we think in the West and the parts of the book that I'm writing about in the West that take place in America. So I did a whole bunch of research. I found out about the Dahomey Amazons, who were a warrior group, and they were the protectors of their society. And I found out about many women kings. And so I said, I am going to write about a woman king. And King Akusa of the Kasongo tribe, which is a tribe that I made up. It's a fictional tribe, but based on the many tribes that I had been researching, came to me. And she made herself known. She's a very strong and a very wise woman. And she has 6 wives. And one of the things that confused some readers was, well, are the wives male or female? And the answer to that question is yes.
Don't you wish you could see people read that section, just watch them, and they go, oh, you know?
Yes. So many people wondered when you said king, and then I saw the pronoun she. That was so confusing. Or when you said wives, but then it was a male speaking. That was so confusing, and I was like, I'm glad it was.
A good confusion.
Yes. Yes.
So talk a little bit about the love between Samuel and Isaiah. I mean, this is very much a novel of the body. You write a lot about the body, and for more than just queer love, you're writing about all the sexual underpinnings of slavery, the abuse, the humiliation. I mean, so many things, and their love stands in a shining opposition to that in so many ways. So talk about imagining yourself into that physical world.
One of the great things about my upbringing, both on my mother's and father's sides of my family, they are rooted in the South of America. And my father's people are rooted in Savannah, Georgia. And my mother's people on her mother's side are rooted in Dillon, South Carolina. And every summer, I used to go down to South Carolina to visit with my great aunt Annie, who was my great grandmother's eldest sister. And we would spend time at her house. What I did not know was that her house was built on the plantation that her grandmother was enslaved upon. She and her husband, my aunt, great aunt Annie and her husband, built that house on a plantation. And I played on that plantation as a kid, not knowing the history, not knowing the ghosts that were haunting that place, the spirits that were watching over me. And so I was imbued with a particular Southern sensibility. I could, by the time I was age 7, I knew the difference between what it felt like in the South and in the North, what it smelled like in the South and in the North, how the people behaved in the South and in the North, the dynamics of race in the South and in the North. And these things informed me. And the Prophets is in some ways paying homage to that sense of Blackness that is uniquely Southern. Mm-hmm. Because Southern Black people love you in a way that is untold, embrace you in a way that is full, that is not replicated in other parts of the country. There seems to be more distance between us as we migrate out of the South. The South hangs on to something that I can only call a joyful Blackness, because it seeks to restore what might have been lost. So when I visit my grandparents in the South, when I visited them in the South, they would hug me so long to the point where it became uncomfortable for me, but they were like, no, longer, because we are putting back into you something that was taken away. Mm-hmm. And when I imagine Samuel and Isaiah, I wanted their love to do that too, to restore something that was taken away. So it had to hang on, even as people are trying to pull it apart, even as events make it seem impossible for them to love one another, their love hung on.
Oh, I love that. You need to come to New Orleans. We give great hugs here.
I'm not surprised. The South is just different when it comes to things like that.
Although all hugs are great right now. I mean, this time period we're in. But talk a bit about what it's like to write about sexuality, because it's such a powerful subject. It's such a topic of, I mean, it's a moment when we're most powerful and we're most vulnerable all at the same time. So there are all these incredibly interesting and inherent contradictions there. And when you do that as a writer, you're sort of laying yourself bare because you're daring to go there and to put this vision of yours in the world. And that's a moment of great vulnerability. Was that hard for you?
Yes, in terms of craft, it was hard for me because I was trying to find the balance. Like, where is it that it becomes pornography? I don't want it to be pornography. I want it to be beautiful. But I also want it to be explicit. Mm-hmm. And where do I find that thin line? So from a craft standpoint, that was very difficult. And what I came to was when two people are in love and are engaged in the act of making love or having sex or lust, whatever it may be, it's not just the two of them that are engaged in this. It is also the environment that they're in. So nature plays a big role in whatever that engagement is. And so when I was writing about Samuel and Isaiah, I always made sure to talk about the smells that were around them, the stars that were watching over them, the animals that were looking at them, the hay that they were laying upon. All of those things are as sensual and matter just as much as the lovemaking. And so that makes it something magical and beautiful, no matter how explicit it gets.
Well, this is the most sensual landscape I've encountered in quite some time. I mean, right down to the plants, the flowers, the gardens, the rivers, the mud. I mean, the mud in this book is quite wonderful. I mean,
um, shout out to the proofreader at Putnam, who made me into essentially a junior botanist by correcting me in terms of what flowers were in bloom at what time in this landscape, and what time of day they were in bloom, because she was really crucial in helping me to understand the role of flowers in this book, and their fragrances and things of that nature, such that I could ensure that the reader gets a really good and luscious sense of this environment.
exactly. Is it fun to read when you read your own words of description?
Sometimes, sometimes I'll read the work, and I'll come across a particular passage that I did not remember writing, sorry. And I'll just be blown away by the prose, and feel guilty for thinking that highly of my own work.
Oh.
Because I don't want to feel like, oh, I think I'm such a great writer. So I always want to kind of like take it down a notch, Robert. But I'm pleased by some of the language, particularly in the parts where it's describing a sensual environment. I like when the characters are engaged in a bit of play, when they're playful with one another. That is also a kind of sensuality. So I love to read those moments in the book. I haven't gone back to read the Prophets as much as I think I should. But when I do come across a particular passage that evokes that sort of sensuality, I sort of, for a brief moment, revel in it.
Well, if it's any consolation, sometimes I would stop and read a sentence aloud. Whenever I read poetry, I read it aloud. I read it to my dogs. I mean, just so I have a built-in audience all the time.
Oh,
but not appreciative, by the way. But nevertheless, I mean, the language is that beautiful and rich, and you are transported by it.
Thank you.
Now, the other thing that I've heard you say before and talk about is that gender norms can be dangerous. And one of the things you do so brilliantly in this book is transcend that binary perspective. So talk about the freedom in that, and what it's like to push beyond those things in your writing.
When I think about the problems we face as a human society, so much of it can be attributed to the violence of making people be what you want them to be, as opposed to accepting them for who and what they are. Whether that is enforcing women into this domestic role, or ensuring that men are the strong protectors. All of these things are virtues of patriarchy, trying to put us into these little categories to make us help this society function the way patriarchs want it to function. Ridding myself, at least in the artistic or creative process, of those norms, or at least shining a light on how they're harmful, was incredibly freeing. Because what it did was it allowed these characters to be not necessarily larger than life, but as Toni Morrison would have put it, large as life. So they're not boxed in, and then I'm hamstrung as a writer as to what they're allowed to do. If I just remove some of those boundaries, the story can open up in ways that are surprising for me as a writer, and maybe for readers as well. So that was, I didn't come to that immediately. It took me a number of years before I realized I can write this way. And in this way, it will allow me to explore things that I had not considered exploring before. So it freed me in a literal sense.
I think that's why people love this book. It's, I mean, it's a very free book to read. You know, you've done something really new, I think, in a lot of ways. You know, one of the other qualities of the prophets, of course, which is indicative from the title, is that it's a very spiritual book. It has a kind of daring spiritual framework. So talk a little bit about your own spiritual life. You come from an unusual background in your family. Yeah. You've done lots of research in all different kinds of religions and come to interesting conclusions about them. So talk about that.
Sure. I grew up in a household where on my mother's side, through her father's line, my family is Nation of Islam. And on my father's side, they're all Southern Baptist or African Methodist Episcopalian, so dyed-in-the-wool Christians. Luckily for me, my mother rejected both of those paradigms. She would not call herself a feminist, but she certainly embraces feminist principles because she decided early on, I will not be subject to any system, spiritual or otherwise, that deems me secondary because I am a woman. That requires me to shrink myself in order that somebody else might feel larger. So she kind of blazed a trail that I didn't realize then, but I realize now allowed me to walk down that path as well, because I subsequently had to reject both of those things because neither of those paradigms, Nation of Islam or the Christianity, had room for me as a Black queer person. And while I loved the music and the rhythm and the reverie of Christianity as practiced in Black Christian spaces, and a lot of it actually informs the rhythm of the prophets, I also realized that largely I am unwelcome in those spaces, even though the music you hear coming out of the Black church is a product of queerness. People might not want to admit that to themselves, but chances are your choir director, your organist, the best singer in your church is queer, LGBTQIA+. And the silences around that are disturbing. The attempt to erase that truth is disturbing. And one of the things I discovered in my research was that despite the fact that Christianity is also used as a liberatory tool for Black people to survive the ravages of slavery, it is also the point at which we are indoctrinated into believing that queerness is sinful. Because prior to Christian missionaries invading African spaces, queerness was not even thought of as an aberration. It was just thought of as part of the landscape. Nothing to be looked at sideways. And this is also one of the reasons why I was afraid to write the prophets, because I knew that I would have to confront that history, and that for many, religion is considered a sacrosanct institution, and that my criticism of it would be seen as sacrilegious. And so, but I could not tell this story without bringing to light that essential truth.
What about your knowledge of the Bible? This is this is rich, this book, in that. So talk about its influence on you.
I have been reading the Bible since I was about maybe 8 or 9 years old, front to back, cover to cover. But what was more influential than the actual structure and words of the Bible was how I heard preachers speak it. The orality of the Bible was actually more of an influence on me in terms of writing the prophets. And biblical scholars can probably see in my writing of the prophets that a lot of the, not just the subject matter, but the rhythm of sentences is very much influenced by that sort of Christian fire and brimstone sort of talk. But my relationship to the Bible is also one that is sort of fraught, because it is the same book that people are using as the source to deny me my humanity and to deny many others their humanity. There is a great deal of violence in the Bible, a lot of it perpetrated by God, which is one of the scariest things in the Bible. Like if you were an alien coming down from Venus or Mars and you read the Bible, you would be terrified of God, because God is very cruel in the Bible and capricious. And even in the New Testament, where God is supposed to be nicer, he continues to be mean and cruel. Even through Christ, in the Revelation, you get to see Christ as a warrior, and he is frightful. So Christians talk a lot about love, and I'm hard pressed to find it in the Bible. Not to say that I can't find it, because there are some beautiful passages in Psalms, in Proverbs, that evoke the kind of love that you wish humanity could embrace. So I leaned on those pieces to kind of inform my ideas of love. But I also leaned on the violence when I was talking about slavery, because the violence in the Bible is what I'm replicating in the prophets when I talk about the violence of slavery.
Mm-hmm. So tell me, what has it been like to see your book embraced in this way?
Surprising. I had prepared myself for all these 14 years for people to not like this work and not take it at face value at all. I thought I would be ripped apart by critics, that readers would find it offensive, and that it would be some obscure work that maybe 100, 200 years from now, someone would discover and be like, hey, let's investigate this book that Robert Jones Jr. wrote in 2021, much like what happened to Zora Neale Hurston with Their Eyes Were Watching God, which was not celebrated in her time and did not come back into public consciousness until Alice Walker rediscovered it. So the fact that the work is largely being embraced, that people are largely finding it to be of value, puts me in a state of utter gratitude, because I had not anticipated it. And I am so thankful that it's resonating with people and that my intentions are coming across for so many.
It's an amazing thing. It really is.
It is. It truly is.
I mean, because every now and then, you read a book and you think, I was made to read this book. I mean, it's one of those books that you feel such a thrill of discovery when you read. You can't wait to pass it along to the next person.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Robert Jones Jr. And thank you for the work that you do. Your next book better not take 14 years.
I hope not. And thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thanks for being here.